Super excited to have you here in our podcast, and welcome. We've known each other for quite a while now, and it's my honor to invite you and to share your story, share your journey, and how you've come across from your career to now working at Swinerton.
Thanks, Niran. It's really great to be here, and I appreciate your generosity.
So, people have known you for, for a while. I think, they knew you as innovation leader. Tell me, as a first part, let's give your background that many might not have known, actually. Let's start with the background.
Yeah. Well, you know, I started learning to build as a kid. I was, interestingly enough, so my dad was a type 1 diabetic, in an age when there wasn't a lot of medical tools to deal with that, right? So he got sick from a pretty young age, but he was also, he'd grown up in the similar environment that I'd grown up in North Idaho, in a very working class, almost primary economy situation. And as you know, my parents both had me pretty young, but then the trick was that my dad got sick pretty quickly and wasn't able to work as much, but had a lot of skills as a carpenter and a plumber. His primary trade was as a plumber. And so as a kid, he started these businesses and he would do like pool and spa repair, or he'd do like plumbing repair. And I would be his eyes and his hands oftentimes. And so, some of the first jobs I had were as a 6, 7 year old with my hand in a toilet digging out plastic toys that kids had shoved down there, right? And but so right away I was exposed beyond the surface of things. I think one of the big things about understanding construction from a primary putting work in place point of view is that there's so much depth to it, and there's so many of these mechanical and physical things that are behind this like pretty piece of drywall that you see. And so I was exposed to that at a pretty young age and started putting together those systems, and being those eyes and ears, got exposed to that at a young age. At the same time, that also encouraged me to look at science and try to think about ways to move out of that. My dad was always like pounding in my head this idea of efficiency and also work smarter, not harder. And as I've gotten older, I kind of have learned to disagree with that a little bit. I think you have to work smarter and harder. But, he, in a lot of ways, the work smarter part, I had to get over the procrastination and the sort of entitlement part of that. But, as I studied science and did all these things and was really excited about just learning and also having that perspective about doing that real work, I excelled early in school and stuff, but I still ended up, through his illness and those things, I ended up really not even finishing out high school in a way that I could go to college right away. So I started into manufacturing and construction right after high school, really during school. Worked on a framing company with a close friend who ended up being a colleague later at Swinerton when I was in my late teens, and got to work on some really interesting stuff, but definitely from the framing and moving materials around, I was continually evolving those opportunities that I had, but also in some ways sort of selling myself short, and one of the things that was always great about being really smart, but also being in the field, was that you could kind of get away with using your brain at times when other folks were just using their strength. And that's really the beginning story for me about innovation, right? Is taking that intelligence, but also that mechanical mind, and applying it to that really early on, applying it to that really basic everyday work of like hauling 2x4s and framing out walls. And then obviously that moved me into other positions and other opportunities along the way. I did a lot of high-end residential work for a long time, which was very much solving complex problems that had very little prior planning and trying to put some prior planning to that, but then also just coming up with completely fresh solutions about ways to achieve these big visions that a lot of clients and architects would come up with, but still not necessarily have a way to put it into practice. And so all of that experience also got me really interested in the ideas in the technologies that are in construction, right? Because so many of those things that we were doing manually and going out every morning and setting up and cutting 2x4s and doing all that, so much of that could have been more and more automated. But somebody has to put together the system and start to build the layers of automation, and at scale that was always so difficult, right? Always working for a different client, always working for a different architect, always working on a different kind of building, and never really having those opportunities to put it all together. So I know my way around a nail gun. I can recondition a air compressor on the job, kind of thing, and really understand how all those pieces and everything fit together, and then also the technical parts of it.
Yeah.
The load paths and how and why we do things. So a lot of that comes with kind of the engineering mind too. But yeah, and then to like accelerate into that, into like, I guess the next thing is construction, right? Is there anything more about that that's interesting, that early?
I want to know, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I want to know from the field, when did you start using technology? Like, because there's multiple phases of construction technology, like, where you can go back far beyond as well, like, but what was that first piece of technology that when you saw that, oh, wow, this could be used? And then we can talk about how far we've come ahead, like, but when did you first start getting involved in technology in construction?
Yeah. Well, I guess probably in 2007, my sister gave me the first iPhone. I guess it was 2008. Maybe it was 2009. It was somewhere in that range. The very first little iPhone, right? Before that, I had been using a BlackBerry on job sites
Yeah.
and trying to get things in an email form, right? And she gave me that iPhone, and like immediately we started pulling up drawings. We started looking at drawings on site, getting people to email me the most recent or an updated drawing from the engineer, and being able to immediately take that out to the folks on site, and basically saving a day or two of time between like getting that stuff out and getting it printed and getting that clear instruction on site. Those are probably some of the original aha moments that really led me to exploring this stuff deeper, because what I realized at that point in time is that what we really wanted to do on a job site is have clear instruction. Like construction workers want to show up and get stuff done. Like the best day is the day where you can just show up, you have everything you need, and you get to work and you get the thing done. And so that really gave me this idea of focus on what we're actually trying to deliver to the field, because we're not going to stop getting on a job site and like putting stuff together. We're not going to, like, that's always going to be the core of what we do in construction, is we build stuff. But the bottlenecks to that are getting the right information at the right time, getting the information early enough to make sure that the materials are there. All of those things that result in like, now I got a pile of stuff to work with and I know exactly what to do with it. And so there's nothing more frustrating than sitting on a job site and either incurring costs yourselves or billing a client even when there's nothing to do.
Yeah.
Or you're just sitting around smoking cigarettes or whatever it is that's going on, right? And the opportunity with that was not a process opportunity. It's not a thing about people. It's not about cracking the whip. It's about being able to bridge those gaps between how far away the office is and how far and where the job site is, and how far and how complicated that a set of drawings might be, and turning that into actual degrees and cuts on a job site.
Interesting. Yeah. Because we at Quant we talk a lot about, productivity and time on tool, or when you talk to oil and gas people, they call it wrench time and tool times, right? And we talk about productivity and wrench times at like 35% or 50% on average industry, like and it's a lot about having the right information at the right time. It's not just about the and are the tools stored in the right places? Do they have the right information? Actually, like, and then I feel like when 2007, like, that was, that was pretty early on. So you've kind of started dabbling on that to provide that to the field. And then drawings, like, is a foundation of the, how people build actually in a way. And I think that that's really interesting. Yeah. And from the field, like, where you've seen these different technologies around the same time, iPhone was coming up, but it took a little while for companies like Procore and PlanGrid and Autodex to kind of start putting that out in a scalable way, actually. Like, and I think it was about 2012, almost like 5 years since they had this, but I think it took a little time for to get to that point where it was scalable, actually, right? Um, when did you start your as a construction technology or innovation in a position of innovation?
So I continued to do that on job sites. So until, I went through some personal stuff. I made some changes in my life and really was having some success in that construction space, but saw some real capabilities gaps. Like nobody around me was going to start solving those technology problems for me. And so I realized that that there was a big gap in my skill set. And my skill set gap initially I identified as an accounting and finance skills gap, because of what I couldn't do is I couldn't talk about the ROI of doing things differently on the job site. It was a gap that was missing from that bottom up approach, is I couldn't talk about the economics of bringing these new tools in. And so I wanted to learn to do that. So I spent a bunch of time, I took a bunch of accounting courses, started doing microeconomics, macroeconomics, and really finding that stuff. But then what I found in the process was something else that I really fell in love with, which was mathematics and quantification, right? So all of a sudden, this whole world of discrete solutions was there in front of me. And then I realized also, by learning a lot of the technology, I became an expert in Excel and all the these other tools that I'd never learned to do. At that point, I was even learning to type, right? Like here I am in my mid 30s, and I've been on a job site my whole life. I didn't even know how to type. you know I was like doing the like bam, 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 bam thing on the keyboard, right? So there was all these skills that I needed to develop, and I just dove headlong into all those skills. And what that really turned into was understanding calculus and linear algebra and all of that, that side of things. I continued down that path and really found a lot of joy in understanding the finance side of it, because that's really how I had originally come there. But I started looking at all these things like pricing, like derivatives pricing, and the mathematics fundamentals behind, behind all these alternative investment vehicles and all that, and thought that I wanted to go into finance for a while. But anyways, I ended up getting into school at the University of Virginia, studied there for a couple of years in commerce and economics, kind of capped that out with some work on vehicle to grid, which is really about how this very rigid electrical system works together with the financial part of the tariffs and how electricity gets sold, and looking at a lot of the competition dynamics. So really the game theory behind all that, and started coming back into that world of like quantifying a lot of qualitative information, right? And that's what we do in economics, is we find ways to quantify all this qualitative stuff. Again, these like just opening up world after world after world from learning, and really being in love with that, but at some point needing to bring that back into the business. And so after a couple of years of the startup work in vehicle to grid, and then also pursuing some opportunities in consulting and potentially finance, I really realized that my place was back in construction. And so I came to Swinerton, came back years ago, and luckily it was the right timing and the right place. And they were thinking about productizing some of their markets. And so that skill set of having the construction background along with that business, marketing, and finance education, finally the timing started to work out.
Timing, actually, yes. That's a great story. It kind of reminded me of a story which I'm going to bring a little tangential story here, actually. This might not be perfectly correlated, but it reminded me of a story of Robert Johnson, actually. I'm sure you know the story of Robert Johnson, where he got disappeared in the crossroads, and one day he came out of nowhere, and he was the best blues guitarist in the world. Actually, I'm sure we know the story. Actually,
Yeah.
so you went to University of Virginia, which will be your crossroads, and I'm sure we don't want to tell the what Robert Johnson did over there because that's still a myth. But at least, but at least at the University of Virginia, you learn calculus and maths, which is and quantum, quantum quantifying things, and that's where the name quant comes from. Actually, is that the deep appreciation of numbers and maths to quantify things to make decisions actually, and from there you came into the world of innovation and technology. That's really from the field to finance and proving the ROI to here, right? That's such an amazing story. In our world as well, when we talk about construction tech, even to our customers, all to or maybe other stakeholders as well, we want to quantify in many cases the ROI of using a technology actually,
Yeah.
and we have a conversation in our office about can you really quantify a collaboration tool? Can you really quantify um, you know a communication tool actually and many times what do you compare it against, right? Because I had this conversation yesterday with an oil and gas company, which we're expanding in that market a lot right now, and it was what are we comparing it against? Are we comparing against something that's been the past? Are we comparing against industry averages and things like that? So it's such a core part of the problems we try to solve. We can talk about the ROI as well, but in parallelly in that, Aaron, I know that you've also been doing singing on the side or writing music on the side. How did you get time to do both?
I don't have time to do both. Well, actually, to be honest, I do compartmentalize. When I get up in the morning, I don't have rules for myself about how I'm going to get my day started. I don't, I do the first thing I do when I wake up is I check my emails. I get that stuff out of the way. And then maybe if I have time by like 8:30, I'll walk the dog and take a deep breath. But it's really, I think calendaring everything is a big thing. So being disciplined about just giving everything a place is a big part of it, and respecting that. I still definitely go over on meetings a lot, that kind of stuff, but just compartmentalizing that stuff is a great way to get through it and to make sure that you've also got time. I did this exercise when I was in school, and it was basically like, okay, well, give yourself this 24-hour calendar for a week and show all the time. Okay, cross out the time that you're sleeping. Cross out the time that you are at school or whatever it is, at work. I don't have children, and so that provides removes a ton of unstructured attention that is needed to happen in my life, right? So the rest of that time that I have is really time that I can plot out and figure out what I need to do with it, right? And so realistically, if you want to be really great at music, or you really want to be really great at anything, you have to put a lot of time into it. So that's why I'm not really great at music. I did spend some time when I was younger doing a lot of it. I have some natural talent in that space, and I think that comes with it. But I'm also painfully aware when I work with other musicians that if they're not putting in time, it's really obvious. And so I try to be really intentional when I have that time to really focus on learning things. I think the biggest gap for me has been like memorizing lyrics. I'm really fast with the musical part of it, with the tuning and the tonal and the note and the rhythm aspect of music. The memorizing lyrics is probably the biggest challenge as a singer and not having more time to put into it.
That's very interesting. And I have two questions around that. One is when it comes to construction, right? What do you think is what genre of music is best suited for maybe there's genres of construction as well. There's wood construction, there's metal construction, and there is concrete construction. But we have a team in the office that we have a bunch of guys who have a particular theme they listen to actually. And it happened naturally. It wasn't my decision actually. I'll tell you about that. But do you connect something with the music era, some genre?
Well, I think it's more about project phases, right? So like when we're in like pre-con is like Sinatra, you know, it's like, hey, we're gonna do this, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right? And then all of a sudden that pre-con gives way to like a little bit more momentum, and now we're into like some hip hop when we first start getting a project started, and everybody is kind of like talking about how great they are and like what, and they're talking themselves up and they're hyping themselves up and they're getting ready to go out and do the thing, right? As soon as the diggers hit the ground and everybody realizes that they don't know what they need to know, now all of a sudden you're like Henry Rollins,
Yes. Like,
right?
yeah.
Like taking our shirts off, like showing the tattoos and getting down to like my way or the highway, right? And then things soften up a little bit maybe, but they still stay pretty hard, you know. It stays pretty hard right up through the, you know, these kind of commissioning stages of a project. And then once those commissioning stages start, it's almost like, you know, we start to get back to some of the soft rock, maybe some yacht rock happening at commissioning. You know, we're singing the same old songs and like there's some familiarity to this thing and people start to realize that we're going to get through it and the vibe starts to come up a little bit. But I don't think there's one big genre for the whole business, but there's definitely a different mood for each of these different stages of construction.
Thank you for sharing that. Actually, yeah. When I think about it, I think more about from a big. We're a big prog rock company in a way. I feel like that. We have a big and we have somebody who's big into like Yes and Rush and Deep Purple, and then we have fans of Porcupine Tree and Tool, and I mean I listen to everything But when I think about all these melodies that are coming together and this they're not typical 4x4 beats. They're it could go different ways, and you all layer that together and finally make some music. And that's like layering of BIM. When you put multiple layers of BIM clash detection, actually when you do that, I feel like construction can become a prog rock at a certain point, actually, and
Yeah.
finally gets the rhythm. But it's so important for the project manager to kind of okay, hey guys, don't go too far over there, just kind of bring it all together in this beat here somehow, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, they're definitely not experimental jazz, right? The experimental jazz has no part in the thing when that drummer starts like breaking out of the chord rhythm and people can't count it anymore. They're like, "Whoa, get rid of that guy." So definitely the repetitive thing, you know, there's like there's a couple of Iron Maiden songs that we do, and one of them is like it's called The Trooper, right? And it sounds crazy and complicated, but it's a lot of repetition, right? So it's like, and you can't drop a beat, right? It's like like, and it just it repeats with a minor amount of variation. But then you're right. Then the layering comes in and all that. But the layering is built on this like solid foundation of process and focus. And then oftentimes that allows you to move faster too, right? So you can move much faster with that like predictable foundation. And then that thing starts to kind of gain momentum. And you just have to hope that the drummer isn't rushing it too hard.
Yeah, 100%. That's it also connects with when we go to the job sites, they'll have speakers out there, and as they're hammering stuff or painting stuff, they're playing some music actually, I love it. So from that, right, we find these comparisons between now science, construction, finance, music, all that together, it's a great industry to be a part of actually. Um, Moving forward to Swinerton, um, where I know that there's multiple technologies that you might have been experimenting with or kind of fully deployed there as well. Um, what has been your history of deploying technology or how the adoption has happened in certain? I'm sure it's a pretty massive organization where it's phase wise and there are legacy systems right now. how do you see about deploying technologies? And maybe a little bit on the whole timber side as well, because I know the timber is something that you were close to as well. You had expertise in there, and Swinerton also has an expertise in that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and a lot of this boils down to the strategy because of the core operational structure, right? So one of the things that we learn from the business economists and the business researchers like Michael Porter and Clayton Christensen is that, and even before that, like back to Chandler's work about organizational structure starting to drive strategy, is that in a business where the margins are limited like they are in general contracting, the opportunities for change are very limited. The primary objective is to prevent fee erosion, and there's very few opportunities to grow fee outside of incredibly creative and market power. So, like, the few folks that we've seen be able to come in and take over procurement and change the procurement approach have been able to do it because of their simply because of their size, not because of their appetite for innovation or change, right? And so you have those market forces that can determine the potential for even using technology solutions to bring in those things. And then oftentimes at scale, those solutions are so complicated that they require new technology to achieve them, right? But then you look at what's available to the average general contractor, and it's like, you know, they're already planning, so they need like tools to maybe plan better, and then these other risks that are emerging that are constantly kind of eroding their fees, employment disputes or labor disputes, issues with planning, change orders, rework, all of those things. But for the general contractor, all of that stuff really comes back to whether or not they were able to isolate the risk and push it off on the subcontractor, or if they were able to mitigate the risk somehow beforehand. And I think still the strategy exists on isolating the risk versus adopting technology to absolve the risk. But it takes some creativity to think about that, because you have to make a commitment if what you're really trying to do is remove the risk from the system and de-risk it instead of just transact it to someone else, is then you have to think about a new technology or a piece of software in a way that not only touches the process or enhances the current process, but enables you to do that in a new way, enables you to innovate the process. Now, when it comes to these other businesses, I'm always really curious about why we haven't had like a lot more innovation in the self-perform and the trade side of the business, because that's almost all upside, right? Like where we do see actually a ton of adoption is in a lot of the electrical trades and a lot of the mechanical trades. But what's interesting is as soon as they start to do that, we start to classify that work as manufacturing work, and it no longer, and the construction industry no longer gets credit for it, for those improvements. But there are there have continued to be a ton of growth in these trade businesses because their upside is really big, right? Because they're still coming into the market competing against people who are operating traditionally. And so they've got a potential competitive advantage and these potential margin growth advantages.
And I really love your concept about ultimately what technology is enabling you to do is to be de-risk the system. And because general contractors, CM especially, are primarily just their job is to manage the risk actually, right?
Yeah.
Either own the risk or pass the risk to the sub or to vendor or to the owner. And when you think about that, a process that actually is going to de-risk, a system that's going to de-risk some of the things, or are we passing it on to somebody else actually, right?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, I think the subs gets to own the risk, and that's the reason why traditionally what I know is they also have a higher upside because they undertake that risk of either procurement, labor fluctuations, or even legal part. So they have a higher margins because of that actually, right?
Yeah.
And do you see a more opportunity right now on the self-perform side or the GC side that there is an opportunity to innovate?
I think there's opportunity on the GC side to innovate because of the opportunities on the self-perform side, right? So like the reason why we're in this position, the reason why GCs are no longer master builders, why a lot of GCs are just like financial transactionalists, they're basically like risk traders, is because we haven't been able to de-risk the whole process, right? But as soon as we start de-risking these other trades through planning and through certainty and all that, and the way that we set projects up, now all of a sudden the capital monsters in the game are the GCs, and also the opportunity to bring those things into the fold and coordinate under one roof start to become more and more appealing, right? So the market power has almost always rested in the general contractor on this side of the table. So yeah, I mean, people have also experimented with bringing that self-perform stuff, but the culture of a GC is so risk off that it has actually been really hard to bring that self-perform stuff back into the central core builder business, because you can't run those other businesses with the same kind of risk profile that you're running the GC, right? And so there's that fundamental conflict between those two things. So and then you have that capabilities gap problem with the technology, which is that you're not going to get those gains on day one, and you're going to have these overlapping systems where you've got to implement the software, you got to train people, but then you've also got to then adjust your business model, and maybe you got to start chasing more work, or maybe you got to run your business and your outlook in a different way, and that takes time. And so there's always this gap between the capital outlay for a new technology and the capability growth into the organization that ultimately turns into ROI. And so that risk is not just it's not there. There's no arbitrage in that risk. It's slow growth, and it's over time, and it's economic profit that occurs, not immediate accounting profit.
That's a really good point, actually, because we have customers who has aims to become a verticalized construction management system where they do all the things, like from sourcing to workforce to and procurement and everything, and put it in one umbrella. But it seems like because of the nature of how each of these cultures are differentiated, and there's a different way that each business function has their KPIs, putting it all under one umbrella, if they're already operating in a certain way, then that's massive change and shift they need to do as an organization to bring that into one group, actually, right? Because one way I'm thinking I'm just going to de-risk it, but the other department is like, this is actually, I like this actually, so it's a kind of very like, it's a something that is interesting, but maybe that has to start from the beginning and not do later on.
Yeah, or think about how you're actually doing that. I think what's interesting is there's a lot of these organizations that have highly collaborative design at the heart of what they're doing. They would probably be really good at being an integrated builder, but those groups tend to be more focused on just improving the general contracting part, and they're getting big gains out of the way that they just deliver a project, right? And the folks that probably have the bigger pain points about dealing with the trades are the ones that are more engaged in hard bid and heavy risk contract delivery, right? That have those capabilities. And so there's multiple layers here which create a conflict in there's this idea in economics called mechanism design.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really where you try to align incentives and capabilities. So you have this problem where you may be able to align incentives, but if you also don't have common capabilities, that new system won't work out. So you have to both enable people to have access to this new way of doing it, but then you also have to combine their motivations. And that continues to be a challenge when, for us, when we have this fee erosion problem on one side of the table, and then we have this room for taking risk and doing things in a better way on the other side of the table. How much do we want to let those guys run? The shared information can sometimes be too much for one brain to process.
I have two examples from that. One is like P6 as a scheduling software is a really good example of that, where it's used for legal de-risking and legal risk mitigation,
Exactly.
versus the builders actually are guys in the field are using something else to build it, either Excel or sticky notes or smart sheets, or I'm sure there's new tools right now, like they're using and it's like completely two ways. I think they're happy to each other. They've tried to connect multiple ways, but it's kind of like a separate system they work on actually at this point.
It is. It will. And the challenge is that the challenge is like any of these separate systems is that you have you don't have mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive methods, right? So the data models are different. So like you end up with all these many to many relationships, and those many to many relationships get really confusing and become really difficult to track. So like if you were to build your P6 model with the mutual exclusivity of activities in mind, then you could simply just nest all of these individual activities into one, right? But then we know when we're on a job site that like nothing is really ever done, right? It's not done until like it's all ready and we walk away from it. So like none of those milestone activities that we're looking at in the P6 schedule, like they get to a substantial completion point, but there's still like loose ends everywhere. And that's what we're dealing with, from a trade point of view, is like we're constantly dealing with trying to prevent some of the loose ends, dealing with some of the overlaps, a lot of these like incongruencies, and then also just figuring out how to make little interruptions work on the job.
From an innovation perspective right now, Aaron, like what do you think are the technologies that you see are you're excited about, or just categories, or you can name some technologies? Like, do you see any of the technologies? Like, I can talk, on my side, but like, I think there are technologies that can take the ownership of the risk actually, and then that's a longer conversation. But I think there are financial technologies, technologies that can take the ownership of the risk for the technology and kind of like be like part of the process as well, but what technologies are you like excited about right now?
Yeah, I mean, high level enabling tech is obviously the LLM stuff, right? Because enabling us to quantify work and quantify these problems that we have without necessarily having to actually have a really strong structured data model to approach them, is open. That opens the opportunity for us to de-risk before we start making changes. It gives us this opportunity to really start doing that data analytics thing to our business much better across a range of inputs and variables. But that being said, we are also seeing a rapid growth in the computer vision world, where the new computer vision models are able to go back and query for things and do labeling much faster. And so the idea of being able to do everything from pose estimation and start to understand how people are moving around on jobs to prevent some of the sort of nasty stories that we don't hear about, like repetitive motion injuries and these things that people inherit and cause our carpenters to have to retire at 55 kind of things. That's there, but then also just understanding the complication of the motion on a job site without having to have a perfect structured model for it is a really powerful opportunity, because everything that we do, like the work that you're doing with sensors and understanding how people are moving around and where they're at, and that heat mapping, those insights are things that we don't get to capture as individuals on a job. The super can be on the job and watching and walking all day long every day and really still never get the insight of that, like, eye in the sky, what does this all look like? And it doesn't have to be hyper detailed. It can be things, it can be the things like a heat map to just really understand, like, hey, why is everybody constantly congregating in this space? Oh, it's because we're managing materials poorly, right? Like those kinds of things. Like, so we start to see and like you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, it's probably generous to estimate that our folks are putting work in place 40% of the day. Right. And maybe another 20 to 30% of that are these other things we know have to happen, like travel to and from the locations and toolbox talks and safety orientations and all that kind of stuff. But that still leaves 30 to 40% of their day that is taken up with non-value added activities, right? And the more that we can dive in and figure out what those things are and develop plans to solve for those things, that's where that's and maybe at that point, we like what computer vision does is it lets us see the cumulative equation of that stuff. And that's kind of what's been missing from being able to get a good ROI conversation about this, right? Like, because if we can actually see and say there's 30% of the time that is like, that could be value add or could be in training or something else like that, that's a dollar value. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars on a large project a day that we could be investing in technology and tools and processes to solve for that, right? And the problem has been, like we talked about before, is that everything is not just so qualitative, but it's so confounding and what I mean by confounding for the listeners is that multiple variables in a process that seem to be contributing to the same problem, but we can't necessarily suss out exactly what the contributing factors are. We can't suss out how much of each of those things is causing what. And so being able to have those analytical tools to look at these things more clearly helps us to understand much better where to invest and gives us more certainty about, should we be investing in a robot to do this thing? Is this really our bottleneck? And that those information tools are really what's exciting to me.
That's so you mentioned very important point, which is because construction has so much unstructured data, right? Because somebody will call it like, a carpenter will call it 2x2, or another guy will call it like in a post, right? And how do we standardize that? And that has always been a challenge. Our dear friend, what's his name? Nathan Wood actually has a construction standardization, like a program he has built around this, like, but now LLM can do that. Okay, guys, can we call this both the same thing and use maybe so we've done that in our companies where we've collected the schedule of values and kind of like put it all together and say like, okay, here's a combined factor and this is the resources required. Now the resource loading of a schedule doesn't happen in general construction. It happens in oil and gas. It happens in, in public projects. And using that, we were able to generate like in a resource loaded schedule. And it's not 100% accurate, but LLM allows you to do these kind of things. Like, so that actually has been a new innovation that came into the market as well. That LLM has enabled us to standardize without having to go manually and asking everybody to write it in a certain way. But that's a new thing. I love it. And around that, I know that we're at the last few minutes, but Aaron, anything you want to add?
I think the biggest challenge right now that I'm seeing is like, as I'm watching the way that things are changing, is that we need to be really clear about the way that we want to do business and what we want out of our lives and what we want in our business, what we want to do. And the thing that's one of the things that I've learned from doing music and these other things outside of my life and taking them seriously is that, we want to bring our whole person to a job and to our work. But if we do that in a way that is like continues to be self-aggrandizing, right? Like there's this problem that we have in construction, which is vanity, which is that and I'm not generalizing, it's that it's sort of like the rapper versus the poet, right? It's like there's and don't get me wrong, there's some incredible rappers out there, like that, like Aesop Rock, who's going to talk about like what's happening in the world. But it's that idea about talking about ourselves versus talking about ideas. And I think that's the thing that's going to unlock opportunity in construction, is if we stop worrying so much about our own value that we're generating and we start taking that value and imagining what we could do in the future. Because the reality is that there's so much work to do that we're not going to get replaced. And over time, we may end up seeing the job market shift and all that stuff. But the problem has always been, it's not about whether or not robots are coming. It's about who owns the robots. right? And if we all own the robots and we're the ones running the robots, then we get to continue to live these amazing lives. But if we wait and just wait till someone else figures out the robots, then what happens is they own the robots and they own us, right? Like let's go out there and like get our own robots and democratize this thing and like be, you know, be the employee owners, be the beneficiaries in this new way of doing business. But as we continue to sort of just push back and not be creative about the opportunities that are going to come in and replace us, then like that's the difference, is that when you push back, then you get replaced. If you move along and you learn how to use these things and you move forward and you figure out how to exploit the new opportunities, that's when you get to participate. That's when you get to be a part of that future.
I think that, like, I know that the robots are already here, and they're already doing many parts of, in different, either in different manufacturing world or warehouses work or in construction. There are parts of it that we're doing already,
Yeah.
and it's just a matter of now, are we is the insider is going to work on building that, or there's an outsider who's going to come and manage that actually. Like, and I love the part of the, because I think that innovators like you and people we met around the countries that are working on that are the key players to bring this to the market. Yeah.
I mean, resources are limited, right? Like if Elon's going to go build an army of robots, he's got to have robot parts and pieces, right? But if I've already ordered all the robot parts and pieces and we're over here build, like he's not going to be able to get enough robot parts and pieces to replace us, right?
Most of all, like, we our industry and folks like you, and you've spent years and years understanding the construction versus, like, Elon's robot doesn't understand construction yet. So they don't have the data yet to synthesize and like train the robot. And you
He's going
could
to build a
be
great housekeeper. He's going to build a great housekeeper, and the rest of us are going to you know, the rest of us are going to duplicate our own capabilities by building.
while the robots do the housework, you will do the design work, and you are going to develop the plans that that's going to build the houses. Actually, like, that's probably the nearest future we're going to get into. Actually, yes. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Aaron. I
Thank you,
appreciate
Niran.
it.
It's been a
We
pleasure.
would love to like chat more again, and good luck with your journey. Catch up soon.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.